The Ghost of 1970, Chapter 1, The Ring in the Keepsake Box. The California sun streamed through the window of Emberlyn's living room in San Diego, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a metaphor for the memories that constantly swirled around her. At 70, Emberlyn carried a quiet grace, her silver hair pulled back from a face etched with the lines of a life well lived, but also a deep, abiding sorrow. That sorrow had a name: Daniel Dan Hayes. It was 1970. She was 19, vibrant, full of dreams, and hopelessly in love with Dan, her high school sweetheart. He was tall, kind, with a smile that could melt glaciers and a laugh that filled any room. They were engaged, his modest silver ring, engraved with E+D, always, nestled on her finger. Then came the draft notice: Vietnam. He left, a young man with hope in his eyes and a promise on his lips. "I'll be back, Ember. Wait for me." But he never came back. Or so she thought. In 1971, a terse telegram arrived. Lance Corporal Daniel Hayes, missing in action, presumed deceased. The world had stopped. Emberlyn's heart had shattered into a million pieces. She attended a memorial service, wept with his parents, and wore his ring on a chain around her neck for decades. She never married, never found love like that again. Dan was her one true love, forever enshrined in the amber of her memory, a young man frozen in time. Now, her granddaughter, Olivia, a bright, inquisitive 25-year-old with a passion for genealogy, sat on the rug, surrounded by stacks of old photos and documents. Olivia was charting their family tree, a hobby that had become an unexpected source of solace for Emberlyn. "Grandma Ember," Olivia said, her brow furrowed in concentration, "I'm trying to verify some of Dan's military records for the family tree, and something just doesn't add up." Emberlyn stiffened. She rarely spoke of Dan. The pain too raw, even after half a century. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well," Olivia continued, tracing a line on her laptop screen, "his initial MIA report, dated April 1971, says he was last seen with his unit, but there's a conflicting report from a different battalion that mentions an unidentified casualty found weeks later in a nearby sector. The description is vague, but it could fit." And then, some of the documents about his official presumed death. They're incomplete. There's no body recovery listed, no detailed evidence. It's just presumed. It's all a bit thin for a military record. Emberlyn felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Presumed dead is presumed dead, Olivia. They searched. They always search." "I know, Grandma," Olivia said gently, "but this just feels off. It's like there's a gap, like something was deliberately omitted." She scrolled through another database. "And then I did a deep dive into some genetic genealogy databases, just out of curiosity. I found a distant relative of Dan's, a third cousin twice removed, living in Wyoming, under a different name." Emberlyn stared at her granddaughter, her mind reeling. "A different name? What are you talking about?" "Robert Smith," Olivia said, her voice dropping. "He shares enough DNA markers with Dan's side of the family to be a distant relative. But here's the thing. His birth year is 1951, the same as Dan's. And when I cross-referenced public records and some old newspaper clippings, his profile, it's oddly blank before the mid-1970s, like he suddenly appeared out of nowhere. And then I found a grainy photo. It's of Robert Smith from about 20 years ago. And Grandma, the eyes, the jawline, it's almost identical to Dan's old high school picture." Olivia pushed her laptop towards Emberlyn. The screen showed a faded sepia photo of a young, smiling Dan Hayes, alongside a slightly pixelated image of an older man with kind but haunted eyes. The resemblance was undeniable. The same strong nose, the same determined set of the jaw, the same gentle curve of the lips. The eyes. They were Dan's eyes. Emberlyn's hand flew to her mouth, her fingers trembling. The ring she still wore on a chain around her neck, the silver, engraved E+D, always, felt suddenly heavy, impossibly real. The ghost of 1970, the love of her life, was not just a memory. He was a living, breathing man, in Wyoming, under another name. The world had stopped once again, but this time, not in sorrow, but in a whirlwind of impossible hope and terrifying questions. Why? Why had he disappeared? Why had he never come back? Chapter 2, The Whispers of Cheyenne. The journey to Wyoming was a blur of nervous anticipation and simmering anger. Emberlyn, despite her age, felt a surge of adrenaline she hadn't experienced in decades. Olivia, ever the meticulous researcher, had mapped out everything. Robert Smith lived in a small, isolated town near Cheyenne, a place that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the vibrant energy of San Diego. "Grandma," Olivia said, as they drove through the vast open plains, "we need to be careful. If this is him, there's a reason he disappeared. He might not want to be found." Emberlyn's heart ached with a lifetime of unanswered questions. "I need to know, Olivia. I just need to know, after all these years." Their first stop in Wyoming was the local historical society, a small, dusty building filled with archives and the scent of old paper. Olivia, using her genealogical skills, began searching for any mention of Robert Smith, any clue about his arrival in the area in the mid-1970s. The local historian, a kindly, bespectacled woman named Martha, was helpful but had little to offer. "Robert Smith? Oh, he's a quiet one. Moved here about 50 years ago, kept to himself, bought that old ranch south of town, never married, just lived his life. Didn't have much of a past that anyone knew." "Didn't have much of a past," Emberlyn repeated, the words chilling her to the bone. It was exactly what Olivia had found in the databases, a blank slate. They found Robert Smith's address, a ranch tucked away at the end of a long, unpaved road. As they approached, Emberlyn's heart began to pound a frantic rhythm. The small, weathered farmhouse stood against the vast, indifferent landscape. A few horses grazed in a nearby pasture. The air was still, heavy with unspoken history. Emberlyn saw a man emerge from the barn, his back to them, carrying a bucket. He was older, with silver hair, a slight limp, and shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the world. But the way he moved, the strong set of his neck, a sudden, sharp memory of Dan, young and full of life, throwing a football in their high school yard, flashed through Emberlyn's mind. "It's him," Emberlyn whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It has to be." But they didn't approach the house. Not yet. Olivia had another lead. In the military records, a name had repeatedly appeared alongside Dan Hayes, Johnny Mac McDonald, his best friend, a fellow Marine who had been wounded in the same area where Dan was reported missing. Olivia found Johnny's address in a small town just an hour's drive away. Johnny MacDonald lived in a modest house, his porch adorned with an American flag and a Vietnam veteran sticker. He was a man in his late 60s, weathered and worn, but with eyes that still held a spark of the young Marine Emberlyn remembered. "Mr. MacDonald?" Emberlyn asked, her voice tentative. "My name is Emberlyn Price. I was Daniel Hayes's fiancé." Johnny's eyes widened, a flicker of shock, then pain crossing his face. Emberlyn? My God, I haven't heard that name in a lifetime. He invited them inside, his movements stiff, his face etched with old sorrows. Emberlyn showed him the old high school photo of Dan. Then the recent one of Robert Smith. Johnny took both, his hands trembling. He looked at them, then at Emberlyn, his gaze filled with a profound, almost desperate sadness. "He's alive, isn't he, Johnny?" Emberlyn asked, her voice cracking. "Dan is alive, and he's Robert Smith." Johnny sighed, a heavy, world-weary sound. He looked away out the window, his gaze distant. He made me promise, Emberlyn, to never tell a soul. He said it was for your own good, to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Emberlyn cried, tears stinging her eyes. "From the truth? From knowing he was alive?" Johnny turned back, his eyes filled with a pain that matched Emberlyn's own. "What happened in Nam, Emberlyn, it broke him. It broke all of us. But Dan, he saw things. He endured things. Things no man should ever see. He was captured, Emberlyn, tortured, for weeks. They thought he was dead. We thought he was dead." He paused, collecting himself. "I found him, Emberlyn, in a makeshift POW camp a few weeks after he was reported MIA. He was barely alive, a skeleton. His mind, it was gone, shattered. I helped him escape. We made it to a field hospital, barely. He was a shell. And then, the military, they offered him a choice, a new identity, a fresh start. They said he was too damaged for a normal life, that he couldn't be the Dan Hayes he once was. They said it was a chance for him to escape the ghosts, to find some peace. A new identity, Robert Smith. Emberlyn felt a wave of nausea. Her Dan, tortured, broken, forced to disappear. Her heart ached with a new, agonizing pain, far deeper than the old sorrow of loss. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been erased. And the whispers of Cheyenne now screamed with the full, devastating truth. Chapter 3, The Scars of Memory. Johnny's words painted a chilling picture of a shattered man, not a deserter. Daniel, tortured, his mind broken, had been offered a life sentence of anonymity, a quiet exile in exchange for escape from the hell he had endured. Emberlyn tried to imagine her vibrant, laughing Dan, reduced to a hollow shell, agreeing to vanish from existence. The thought was unbearable. "He believed it was for the best," Johnny continued, his voice heavy. "He said he couldn't come back to you, Emberlyn, not as he was. He said he was a monster, that you deserved more. He didn't want you to see him like that. He carried so much guilt, so much shame. He thought you would be better off believing him dead. It was a twisted form of protection, I suppose." Emberlyn listened, tears streaming down her face. The relief of knowing he was alive warred with the profound grief of what he had suffered and the decades of deception. She had grieved a ghost, while he had lived a phantom life. "Why didn't you tell me, Johnny?" she whispered, her voice raw. "He made me swear," Johnny said, his eyes filled with remorse. "On my life." He was so terrified. He said if anyone found out, it would unravel everything. His new life, his fragile peace. He was afraid of being dragged back to the nightmares. And I honored his wish. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Emberlyn understood. She couldn't fully forgive, not yet, but she understood the impossible choices made in the crucible of war and profound trauma. Armed with this agonizing truth, Emberlyn and Olivia drove back to Robert Smith's ranch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. Emberlyn's heart hammered against her ribs, a drum roll of a lifetime's worth of anticipation and dread. They found him in the barn, his back to them, meticulously cleaning horse tack. His movements were slow, deliberate. He was a man of the land, weathered by sun and wind. But in his silhouette, Emberlyn still saw glimpses of the young man she had loved. Daniel, Emberlyn's voice, fragile but clear, cut through the quiet of the barn. He froze. His hand, still holding the leather strap, trembled. Slowly, he turned. His eyes, those familiar hazel eyes, met hers. They were older, deeper, filled with a haunted sadness. But they were undeniably Dan's. His face, lined and weary, held the features Emberlyn had memorized from 1,000 photographs. He was gaunt, his hair streaked with silver, his limp more pronounced than she'd noticed from a distance. But it was him, her Dan. He said nothing, only stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock, terror, and a profound, aching recognition. Emberlyn took a step forward, her hand instinctively reaching for the chain around her neck, touching the silver ring. "It's me, Dan. It's Emberlyn." His gaze dropped to the ring, his eyes widening. A tremor ran through his body. Emberlyn. His voice was a rusty whisper, a sound she hadn't heard in over 50 years. You shouldn't be here." Olivia stepped forward, holding out her phone with the DNA match. "We know, Mr. Smith. We know who you are. We know what happened." Dan's shoulders slumped. The fight left him. He looked utterly defeated, yet also strangely relieved. He led them to a small, cluttered office in the barn, filled with dusty books and old tools. He poured them glasses of water, his hands still trembling. He began to speak, his voice gaining strength as he recounted his story, a torrent of suppressed memories unleashed after half a century of silence. He spoke of the ambush, the days in the jungle, the agony of capture. He described the starvation, the beatings, the psychological torment. He spoke of seeing things, of doing things, of becoming someone he didn't recognize. "They broke me, Emberlyn," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "They broke my spirit. When I came back, I wasn't Dan anymore. I was a ghost, a monster. I saw myself in the mirror, and I saw a stranger. I couldn't come back to you. I couldn't. You deserved the Dan you loved, not this broken thing." He spoke of the military's offer, a new identity, a fresh start, a pension if he remained silent about certain incidents he had witnessed during his capture. He had seen too much, knew too much. It was a convenient way to silence a traumatized soldier, to avoid scandal, to bury inconvenient truths. He agreed. He accepted the new life, the new name, the new town. He had built this ranch, isolated himself from the world, trying to outrun the demons that still haunted his nights. Emberlyn listened, her heart breaking for the young man who had been lost, for the life he had been denied, for the 50 years of suffering he had endured in silence. The anger she had felt at his abandonment slowly transformed into an overwhelming, profound empathy. He hadn't chosen to leave her out of malice, but out of a desperate, misguided attempt to protect her from his own shattered reality. The ghost of 1970 was not a vengeful spirit, but a wounded soul seeking solace. Chapter 4, The Unburdening. The hours stretched into the night. Dan, now embracing his true name, spoke of his solitary life as Robert Smith, a deliberate act of self-exile. He had built his ranch, worked the land, and found a quiet rhythm, but the ghosts of Vietnam were constant companions. He spoke of the chronic pain from old injuries, the night terrors, the hypervigilance, the inability to truly connect with anyone. He hadn't felt worthy of love, of happiness, of the life he had left behind. Every year, he confessed, his voice raw, on our birthday, on your birthday, on the anniversary of my disappearance, I thought of you, Emberlyn. I wanted to reach out, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring that darkness into your life. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. I imagined you, happy, married, with a family. That's what I wanted for you, a life without my shadows. Emberlyn, reaching out, took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. I didn't have that life, Dan, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I never married. I couldn't. My heart was with you. Always. A wave of profound sorrow washed over his face, a grief for the life they had both lost separately. Olivia, quietly witnessing this raw, intimate moment, felt a surge of respect for her grandmother and a deep compassion for this man. Her grandfather she never knew. The conversation shifted to Johnny. Dan spoke of Johnny as his lifeline, the only person who knew the truth, who had helped him cross the invisible line from Daniel Hayes to Robert Smith. Johnny, he said, had been sworn to secrecy, but had occasionally sent him news of Emberlyn, snippets of her life, anonymously, just to let him know she was well. It was a small, tortured connection to the world he had left behind. Johnny risked everything for me, Dan said, his voice husky. He saved my life, and he honored my wishes, even when they broke his own heart. Emberlyn understood the depths of loyalty and pain that had bound these two men, silently carrying such a heavy secret for decades. As dawn approached, painting the Wyoming sky in hues of rose and gold, a fragile sense of understanding, if not yet full forgiveness, settled between them. The past, so long a gaping wound, was finally beginning to breathe. Emberlyn and Olivia spent the next few days in Wyoming, staying at a small motel. They gave Dan space, allowing him to process the sudden intrusion of his past into his carefully constructed present. He eventually returned to them, cautiously, tentatively, like a wild animal drawn back to a source of warmth. They visited Johnny again, the three of them sharing stories, piecing together the fragments of Dan's life, the puzzle of his disappearance. Johnny, visibly relieved to finally unburden himself, shared more details of Dan's time in captivity, the severe PTSD he suffered, and the military's subtle coercion, painting Dan's new life as less a choice and more a desperate, necessary escape. The system had effectively erased him, not just from records, but from existence. Emberlyn found old photographs of Dan in Johnny's dusty albums, pictures of young men laughing before the war, their faces full of innocent hope. She saw her Dan, the one she remembered, side by side with the broken man he became. The contrast was heartbreaking. As Dan grew more comfortable, he revealed a hidden talent. He was an artist. His ranch house was filled with charcoal sketches and oil paintings, stark landscapes of Wyoming, but also haunting, abstract pieces that seemed to capture the terror of his war experiences, the isolation of his new life, and the unspoken longing for a past he had left behind. His art was his silent scream, his private therapy. Emberlyn, an art restorer, recognized the raw talent, the profound emotion. His art became a bridge between them, a way to understand the unseen wounds he carried. She saw not just a damaged man, but a resilient soul who had found a powerful way to express his pain. The process of rebuilding their lives was immense. There was no easy path to reconciliation. 50 years of separation, of lies, of unspoken pain, could not be erased in a few days. But the first crucial steps had been taken. The truth, finally revealed, was both devastating and liberating. The ghost of 1970 had finally found its voice, and in doing so, it offered a fragile glimmer of hope for healing, for a future where Emberlyn and Dan, no longer haunted by silence, could begin to truly grieve and perhaps to find a different kind of peace. Chapter 5, The Unspoken Symphony. The initial shock and the flood of confessions slowly gave way to a new, fragile reality. Emberlyn, Olivia, and Dan, no longer just Robert Smith, began the arduous process of navigating a relationship that spanned half a century of absence and trauma. There was no fairy tale reunion, no immediate return to the passionate love of their youth. Instead, there was a profound, quiet understanding, a tenderness born of shared pain, and an immense, almost overwhelming relief. Emberlyn remained in Wyoming for several weeks, extending her stay. She and Olivia spent hours with Dan, listening as he painstakingly pieced together the fragments of his past. Not just the war, but his life as Robert Smith. He spoke of the loneliness, the deliberate isolation, the constant vigilance against the ghosts of his memories. He had channeled his pain into the land, into his art, into a quiet existence where he believed he could harm no one. His art became a focal point of their connection. Emberlyn, with her artistic eye, recognized the genius born of suffering. His landscapes were breathtaking, but his abstract pieces, filled with jagged lines and shadowy figures, were raw expressions of his PTSD. She encouraged him to show them, to perhaps find a new form of healing through recognition. He was hesitant, still guarded, but the flicker of pride in his eyes was undeniable. Olivia, ever the pragmatist, helped Dan navigate the labyrinthine process of reclaiming his true identity, or at least documenting it, reinstating his veteran status, applying for the benefits he was denied, seeking medical and psychological help for his long untreated PTSD. It was a daunting task, made harder by the very system that had encouraged his disappearance. But Olivia was relentless, a fierce advocate for her grandmother, and this man who was, in all but name, her grandfather. Dan began therapy, cautiously at first, then with a growing sense of urgency. The weight of 50 years of unaddressed trauma was immense. He spoke of the guilt for leaving Emberlyn, the shame of his brokenness, the terror of returning to the man he once was. His therapist, a seasoned veteran of veterans' issues, guided him with gentle expertise, helping him to slowly unravel the complex knots of his past. Emberlyn and Dan spent quiet afternoons together. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the Wyoming landscape. He told her stories of his adoptive ranch life, the wild horses he admired, the challenges of living off the land. She spoke of her life in San Diego, her work, her quiet joys, her enduring, unspoken longing for him. One evening, Dan finally shared the contents of a dusty box he kept hidden in his bedroom closet. It was filled with old letters, all unopened, all addressed to Mr. Daniel Hayes in his pre-Vietnam address. They were letters from Emberlyn, sent after his disappearance, filled with her heartbreak, her love, her desperate hope for his return. He had never opened them. He couldn't. The pain had been too great. Emberlyn picked up a letter, her own handwriting from 50 years ago. She opened it, her fingers trembling. It was a plea, a promise of eternal love, a desperate cry for him to come home. Tears streamed down her face, not just for the past, but for the profound loss they had both endured alone. "I'm so sorry, Emberlyn," Dan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I should have been stronger." "No, Dan," Emberlyn said, looking into his eyes. "You survived. That was strength enough. We were both victims of a terrible war and a system that failed its soldiers. But you are here now. That's what matters." Their relationship began to forge a new path. It was not a romantic rekindling of their youthful love, not in the traditional sense. The years, the trauma, the separate lives had created two different people. But there was a deep, unwavering affection, a profound respect, and a shared history that bound them inextricably. They were soulmates, perhaps in a way that transcended conventional labels. They were survivors, finding each other against all odds, piecing together the fragments of a shared dream that had been shattered, and now, slowly, tenderly, was being reassembled. Emberlyn knew she couldn't simply pick up where they left off, but she could be his friend, his confidant, his companion. She could be the one who finally saw him, truly saw him, beyond the trauma and the mask of Robert Smith. She could help him find the peace he so desperately deserved. And in doing so, she found her own peace, the quiet hum that replaced the long-held void. The ghost of 1970 had not just returned, it had found its way home. Chapter 6, A Tapestry of Truths. The process of reintegrating Daniel Hayes into the world, even under his assumed name, was slow and arduous. The military bureaucracy was a formidable adversary, resistant to acknowledging its own role in his disappearance and subsequent re-identification. But Olivia, tenacious and sharp, fought tooth and nail. She unearthed more classified documents, spoke to retired military officials, and even garnered the attention of a sympathetic senator. The media, catching wind of the ghost of 1970 story, provided unexpected leverage. The story of Daniel Hayes, presumed dead, living as Robert Smith for 50 years due to war trauma and a classified military program, captured the nation's attention. Veterans groups rallied, demanding accountability and better support for traumatized soldiers. Emberlyn, initially private, agreed to interviews, not for fame, but to share Dan's story, to shed light on the hidden scars of war. Dan, though still uncomfortable with the spotlight, found a quiet strength in having his truth finally acknowledged. His art, previously a private expression of pain, suddenly gained public recognition. Emberlyn, through her art contacts, helped him arrange a small exhibition in Cheyenne. His abstract works, haunting and powerful, resonated deeply with other veterans and art enthusiasts. His landscapes, full of the stark beauty of Wyoming, offered a glimpse into the quiet sanctuary he had built for himself. The exhibition was a critical and emotional success, a testament to his resilience and talent. Emberlyn eventually returned to San Diego, but her heart remained connected to Wyoming. She and Dan spoke almost daily, their conversations now filled with mundane details of their lives, alongside deeper reflections. They visited each other every few months, Emberlyn traveling to the ranch or Dan making the long journey to California. Their bond deepened, transforming from a youthful romance into a profound, enduring companionship. They were each other's anchors, witnesses to a shared past, and companions on a fragile, hopeful journey into the future. Olivia, too, found a new purpose. Her genealogical skills, once a hobby, were now channeled into helping other families uncover similar hidden histories, particularly those involving veterans lost to trauma or classified programs. She became a go-to expert, her work bringing solace and closure to countless individuals whose lives had been shrouded in mystery. Johnny McDonald, Dan's old friend, found a profound sense of relief. He no longer carried the solitary burden of his secret. He visited Dan often, reminiscing about their youth, the war, and the long, silent years. Their bond, forged in the crucible of combat, was now healed by truth and shared understanding. The question of why Dan chose to disappear and why he never contacted Emberlyn remained complex. It wasn't simple malice or indifference. It was a profound psychological wound, a sense of being fundamentally altered, unworthy of the life he had lost. The military's offer of a new identity was not just a convenience. It was a desperate, if flawed, attempt to save a broken man from himself. Emberlyn understood that his choice, though agonizing for her, was a survival mechanism for him. One crisp autumn day, Emberlyn was on Dan's ranch. They sat on his porch swing, watching the last of the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. He looked at her, his eyes soft, contemplative. "You know, Emberlyn," he said, his voice quiet, "I never thought I'd see this day. I thought I'd die alone, with all my secrets buried. And I thought I'd live out my days grieving a ghost," Emberlyn replied, taking his hand. "But here we are, two old souls, finding our way back." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Emberlyn, for finding me, for not giving up, for seeing beyond the ghost." Emberlyn smiled a genuine, peaceful smile. "Always, Dan, always." The engraved ring, E+D, always, still hung around her neck, but now it felt less like a symbol of a lost past and more like a testament to an enduring connection, a thread that had withstood time, trauma, and the most profound of deceptions. The ghost of 1970 had not just found its way home. It had finally found peace, weaving its fragmented past into a tapestry of truth, healing, and unconditional love. Chapter 7. The Unbroken Promise. Years continued to gently unfold, each one adding new layers to the remarkable story of Emberlyn and Daniel. The initial intensity of discovery settled into a comfortable, deeply rooted companionship. They maintained their separate homes, but their lives were inextricably intertwined. Emberlyn spent weeks at the Wyoming ranch, helping Dan manage his burgeoning art career and simply reveling in his quiet presence. Dan, in turn, visited San Diego, finding solace in the ocean breeze and the vibrant energy of Emberlyn's life. Dan's art gained increasing recognition, not just for its aesthetic merit, but for the profound narrative it carried. His exhibitions became platforms for discussions about veterans' trauma, hidden disabilities, and the long-term impact of war. He spoke publicly, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence about his experiences, becoming a reluctant yet powerful advocate for those who had been silenced by their pasts. His art became his voice, and his voice became a beacon for others. Olivia, true to her passion, continued her work in genealogical reconciliation. She helped countless families uncover their own missing links, earning national recognition for her compassionate and meticulous efforts. Her bond with Dan deepened, evolving into a cherished grandparent-grandchild relationship. He shared stories of his childhood, his hopes before the war, filling in the blanks of a family history that had been deliberately erased. Johnny McDonald, now a regular fixture at Dan's ranch, found a quiet redemption in witnessing his friend's journey toward healing. Their camaraderie, forged in the crucible of Vietnam, was now renewed in the sunlight of Wyoming, a testament to the enduring power of friendship. They spent hours fishing, sharing silent understanding that transcended words. Emberlyn and Dan's relationship was a testament to love's resilience. It wasn't the fiery, passionate love of their youth, but something deeper, more profound. It was a love shaped by 50 years of loss, sorrow, and ultimately, a powerful reunion. They held hands, shared quiet smiles, and found comfort in each other's presence. There was no need for grand declarations. Their bond was a living, breathing testament to an always that had defied all odds. The silver ring, E+D always, still hung around Emberlin's neck, but now Dan often wore a matching simple silver band on his own hand, a quiet symbol of a promise reclaimed, a bond reforged. They never married again, choosing instead a unique partnership based on understanding, respect, and a shared commitment to making peace with their intertwined pasts. Their story became a beacon for others, a testament to the idea that even the most shattered lives can be reassembled, that forgiveness is possible, and that love in its myriad forms can truly transcend time and trauma. One warm summer evening, Dan sat on his porch swing, Emberlin beside him, watching the stars blaze in the vast Wyoming sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and sage. He looked at her, his eyes still holding traces of old sorrow, now also brimming with a profound, quiet contentment. "You know, Emberlin," he said, his voice soft, "I used to think that part of me died in Vietnam. The Dan you knew, the one who loved you so fiercely." Emberlin squeezed his hand. "He never died, Dan. He was just buried, and you, my love, have brought him back." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that still held the spark of the young man she had loved so many years ago. "And you, Emberlin," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "You waited. You kept the promise. You brought me home." Emberlin looked out at the vast, silent landscape, then back at Dan. The void in her heart, once an aching chasm, was now filled with a profound, quiet peace. The ghost of 1970 had not been a curse, but a profound, mystical connection that had waited half a century to finally be acknowledged. Their story was a complex tapestry of pain and redemption, of loss and profound reunion. It was a testament to the enduring power of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the unwavering promise that sometimes even the most impossible ghosts can find their way home.